Now let's take a closer look at breathing. Breathing is the process that ventilates the lungs with alternating inhalation and exhalation of the air. There are two types, negative and positive pressure breathing. The difference is that negative pressure breathing acts like a suction pump, pulling air instead of pushing it down the trachea and into the lungs, as in positive pressure breathing. Mammals, including humans, carry out negative pressure breathing, and frogs are examples of organisms that use positive pressure breathing. In mammals, the way that the lungs are structured is that they are enclosed by a double-walled sac, with the inner layer of the sac and the outer layer being separated by a thin space full of fluid. Surface tension of the fluid makes it so that the layers cannot be pulled apart easily, but can slide past each other. The outer layer is attached to the chest cavity, and the surface tension of the fluid couples the lungs' movements to that of the rib cage. This is how the diaphragm, a sheet of skeletal muscle that forms the bottom wall of the chest cavity, can increase the lungs' volume by contraction. In doing this, air pressure within the alveoli becomes lower than the outside atmospheric pressure. Because air flows from high pressure to low pressure, air then rushes into the respiratory system during negative pressure breathing. The volume of air an animal inhales and exhales with each breath is called tidal volume, and the maximum volume is vital capacity. However, it is important to note that during each breath, the lungs do not empty out and then completely refill. A residual volume of air is always left, since the alveoli do not completely collapse. This causes a low oxygen concentration within the alveoli when newly inhaled air is mixed with oxygen-depleted residual air. Birds also have air sacs in addition to lungs that keep the air flowing into the lungs. They also have parabronchi, which are tiny channels that are the sites of gas exchange in birds. Unlike in mammals, air in a bird's respiratory system only flows in one direction because of the parabronchi, so that with every breath the air in the lungs is completely renewed. This feature allows birds to survive at higher altitudes than humans. Breathing can be both voluntary and involuntary. We can hold our breaths or make our breathing deeper, but is usually regulated through automatic mechanisms. Breathing control centers are located in the medulla oblongata and the pons of the brain. The medulla works through pH cues. For example, when the pH is low, indicating high carbon dioxide levels, the breathing rate increases to get rid of the carbon dioxide. An important thing to consider is that breathing rate needs to be coordinated with the cardiovascular system. This way, there is harmony between the amount of ventilation in the lungs and the amount of blood flowing through the alveolar capillaries. Respiratory pigments bind and transport gases. For a gas, whether present in air or dissolved in water, diffusion depends on the differences in a quantity called partial pressure, the contribution of a particular gas to the overall pressure. An equilibrium is eventually reached when gas molecules enter and leave the solution at the same rate, or the gas has the same partial pressure in the solution and the air. In diffusion, the gas will always travel from a region of high partial pressure to a region of low partial pressure. Loading and unloading respiratory gases. Blood from the pulmonary arteries arrive at the lungs. The blood has a relatively lower partial pressure of oxygen and a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide than the air in the alveoli. Carbon dioxide diffuses into the air within the alveoli, and oxygen dissolves in the fluid that coats the epithelium and diffuses across the surface into the blood. By the time the blood leaves the lungs in the pulmonary veins, its partial pressure of oxygen has been raised and its partial pressure of carbon dioxide has been lowered. Cellular respiration removes oxygen and adds carbon dioxide to the interstitial fluid by diffusion. Blood returns to the heart and is pumped to the lungs again, where it exchanges gases with air in the alveoli. However, the low solubility of oxygen in water does create problems for animals that rely on the circulatory system to deliver oxygen. That is why we have respiratory pigments, which are proteins that oxygen can bind to. Most organisms, including humans, have hemoglobin, but another example is hemocyanin, which can be found in arthropods and mollusks and has copper as its oxygen binding component. Hemoglobin, on the other hand, uses iron and has 4 subunits so that up to 4 oxygen molecules can bind to it. When one subunit unloads its oxygen, the others follow suit by changing shape. Hemoglobin's conformation is sensitive to many factors, including pH. A drop in pH induces a Bohr shift, which decreases hemoglobin's affinity for O2. However, some animals require a superhero amount of oxygen to meet their extreme demands. An example of this is the pronghorn, an antelope-like mammal that needs to sustain high speeds over long distances. Pronghorns consume oxygen at a rate 3 times the rate expected for an animal of their size, a rate fit more for a mouse than a large antelope-sized creature. This can be attributed to the large surface area for diffusion in the lungs. They also have higher muscle temperature. Similarly, other species that are air breathers may require being underwater for prolonged periods of time. What allows them to do this? Wendell seals, an example of a species that can remain underwater for over 20 minutes at a time, have a high capacity to store oxygen in their tissues. Several adaptations create these physiological differences between the seal and other deep divers in comparison to humans. First, the seal has about twice the volume of blood per kilogram of body weight as a human. Second, the seal can store a large quantity of oxygenated blood in its huge spleen, releasing this blood after the dive begins. Third, diving mammals have high concentrations of an oxygen-storing protein called myoglobin in their muscles. These physiological differences from other mammals, both intended for marathon runners and extreme divers, was a result of natural selection acting upon the species, one of the unifying themes of biology that demonstrates the organism's response to environmental changes.